Hello and welcome to the Sheldrake-Vernon Dialogues with myself, Mark Vernon, and Rupert Sheldrake. Hi there, Rupert.
Hello, Mark.
Today we thought we would talk about another of the commonly used concepts that are part of modern science and explore how they have evolved, come to their present sense, and whether the older senses too can be useful now. And Rupert, we thought we'd talk about the idea of natural laws, laws of nature. And I have done a bit of work to see how there's a sort of pivot point with this enormously important early modern figure, Francis Bacon, essayist, Chancellor of England, and very significant figure in early modern science. I mean, to such an extent that he writes this book, the Novum Organum, which is a quite deliberate rewrite of Aristotle's Organum, which was like the sort of method or the instrument of thought that Aristotle wrote. Because whilst Bacon agreed with Aristotle that observation is absolutely fundamental, he felt that there was the need to introduce this new dimension of inference, the idea that from the basis of observations, you could make inferences about the way the natural world is. And so that's the basis of modern science. But it's very interesting to think about this word law and how that gets changed by Bacon, or at least through Bacon, because there's a sort of process of evolution, I think, that gets going. So, with Aristotle didn't really use the word law, but the notion of cause is a big one in Aristotle. And this, though, is meant in the sense of the natural relations, the sort of rational connections between things. So it's not an abstract principle, but it's a description of how the cosmos holds together. And Aristotle famously has these four facets of this so-called cause. There's the material cause, which is just the way the material stuff is, for example, or the teleological cause, the final cause, which is the way that all things tend towards that which is good for them. And so telos is written into the basis of all things. But that starts to shift and change, and you get Bacon taking the idea of God's command or God's word. So God's law, you can sort of feel a bit how these words are kind of connected, which is that which shapes all things in the cosmos, and uses the word law to capture this. So I think in Francis Bacon, he's sometimes people overplay how much of a reductionist he is. I think there's quite a revisionist movement underway in rereading Francis Bacon, actually. So for example, he thought that matter wasn't just dead inert stuff, but does have natural tendencies that are working out through what we call matter. And similarly with this notion of law, he felt that it was still a divine presence that was operative through these natural laws. And there's just an echo of this in language that we still use. So we still talk about obeying laws of nature as if there's a divine presence behind the laws of nature that is there to be obeyed. But nonetheless, it does start off a very profound revision of the sense of this notion of the divine presence. And I think that it's in the 18th century, with the emergence of deism, the idea that God becomes less and less important in terms of the immanent or the continual operation of the cosmos, the idea that God maybe designed it like a great technician, kind of set it going, but then the internal rigor, rationality, law of the cosmos is now what keeps it going. And so you get the sense that law now isn't the divine presence continually working things out, but is an abstract principle that's depersonalized. And so you've got a sense of law as we tend to mean it now. And it's very interesting. I've been writing on William Blake, and so I'm rather alert to this Georgian period. And there seemed to be a bit of an obsession with order in the Georgian world. So words like arrange and regular become much more commonly and widely used. Regular before had actually referred to the priests that were working in the parish, a regular priest, as opposed to a religious priest who lived in a monastery. But regular takes on this meaning that it does now. It's the usual pattern, the ordered pattern, and similarly arrange originally was a was a military term about setting up your forces on the battlefield, but it becomes now this common principle, the way that the cosmos is arranged, people started talking about. And so you get the sense that there's a rationality, a law that's abstract, that's quite godlike in a funny sort of way, that's omnipotence, that can't be contradicted, that is everywhere, uniform throughout, is unchanging, is fixed. So you get godlike reason. I mean, reason is even personalized as if it were a god in the French Revolution, that kind of time. But what you've got is what we now, or at least what people tend to take for granted, that this notion of the laws of nature are these fixed, abstract, impersonal principles that unchangingly, omnipresently operate in the cosmos. But it's this shift from the divine command, and then from the sense that there's a continual presence of the divine within creation that has got lost. So I know you've thought about these things a lot because of your own research and work. And I just does that story, make some sense to you?
Oh, very helpful, Mark. I think that the theological background is really important. And, if you go back to Plato, then it's not exactly law that he's talking about, but the world of forms, this eternal world of ordered rational structure that underlies the world we live in, is there already. And then in Christian theology after St. Augustine, the idea that the logos, the aspect of the divine mind, contains these principles of order that underlie the universe. And Aquinas in the 13th century, where St. Thomas Aquinas actually uses the word law about these divine laws. And so, as you say, Bacon was carrying over a much older tradition, but he took it. I mean, the word law for him was quite important. He was in charge of all the laws of England. He was the Lord Chancellor of England. He was a lawyer, and so law had a special buzz for Bacon. It was an important word. As it took on this more impersonal quality that you talk about with deism in the Enlightenment, then the laws became thought of as more mathematical. And I think that was partly because the big shift for people, or at least the iconic law of nature, was Newton's law of gravitation and Newton's laws of motion. Newton's laws became the principal image for laws of nature in the Enlightenment. And in Trinity College Chapel in Cambridge, there's a statue of Newton holding his prism, and seen as somebody who, saw the laws of nature, the seer of the laws of nature, who understood the mind of God. And the mind of God was essentially mathematical. And so now we have the idea that the laws of nature are mathematical principles primarily. And, if there's a grand unified theory of the universe, several people have jokingly said the idea of physics, modern physics, is to find a grand unified theory with an equation you can print on a T-shirt. The idea it's an equation is the ideal. And that, of course, taps into the Pythagorean tradition, which influenced Plato. It's older than Plato. The idea there's this eternal realm of mathematics beyond space and time that shapes what happens in space and time, but isn't affected by it. It's beyond, transcendent. So I think all of this theological and philosophical background has got built into the idea of laws of nature, together, as you say, with the idea that everything has to obey them. So God isn't just the lawgiver like a cosmic emperor, but he's also the universal law enforcement agency through omnipotence that makes everything obey them. But it's, of course, very anthropocentric, because only human beings have laws and only civilized human beings have laws. I mean, tribal people have customs. They don't have codified laws. These come in with civilization and, the great empires of the Middle East, they have the laws of the Medes and the Persians and so on. So these laws are then very, very anthropocentric because only humans have them. And as C.S. Lewis once said, to say that a stone falls to earth because it's obeying a law makes it a man and even a citizen. So we don't usually think how anthropocentric this concept is. So I think, first of all, there's a problem because if laws are there, even if they are eternal, which I don't think they are, but even if they were eternal, the question that's hardly ever discussed is how do these abstract principles, mathematical or non-mathematical as the case may be, beyond space and time, actually influence the material world? How does something completely abstract, material, thought-like, beyond time and space, influence something in time and space? How the laws reified or instantiated, or whatever word you choose, to cause things to happen. It's not at all clear. In the case of a human being, they know what the laws are. They know they'll get punished if they disobey them, either in this life or in religious frameworks, or some religious frameworks in the next. So people know the law. They know when they're breaking the law. It's a conscious decision to obey laws, or possibly a habit, but it's not something that's enforced by matter. It's something that's enforced by mind. So there's this mental aspect to laws, which has been there ever since Pythagoras and Plato. They're like, and in deism, in late 18th century Enlightenment theology, the god of deism was a kind of transcendent mathematical God who imposed mathematical laws on nature, and everything just obeyed them. But I myself think that the really big problem today with laws is that the assumption has always been that they're eternal. They're universal and they're eternal and they're omnipotent. They share in all the traditional qualities of God because they have this strong theological background and context. But if we have an evolving universe, which we now do since 1966, the idea of the Big Bang is that the universe began very, very small and very hot and is expanding ever since, and more form and structure has come into being within it, and it's still expanding and it's still developing, and the whole universe is evolutionary. Planets and stars are evolutionary. Life is evolutionary. Human culture is evolutionary. New things are happening all the time, which weren't there before. Everything's evolutionary. Then the idea of laws of nature being fixed is really thrown into question. Most scientists don't realize that because they then assume that if the laws of nature are fixed, they must all have been fixed at the very moment of the Big Bang, like a cosmic Napoleonic code, completely fixed, all from the beginning, and the law of the so-called constants of nature, like the gravitational constant and the speed of light and the charge on the electron and so on. So that's the usual assumption. And this leads scientists into an extraordinary set of debates which dominate thinking about cosmology, which is if the laws are fixed, and they could have been otherwise, and the constants could have been otherwise, then they're fixed exactly right for life to emerge. If the mass of carbon atoms had been slightly different, there wouldn't have been organic chemistry. If the charge on the electron was different and so on, life couldn't have evolved. Only if they're exactly right can life evolve. So how come the laws are exactly right for life to evolve and us to be here and discuss it? The cosmological anthropic principle is called. The key point about the universe is that we know for a fact that we're in it and we're talking about it, and that tells us something, that it has to be right for life to evolve. So one school of thought says that there must be some kind of deistic God that fine-tunes the laws of nature, outside nature, a kind of mathematical God who's exactly gets it all right, and it's a kind of intelligent design argument. And to avoid that, a lot of mainstream cosmologists say that actually there must be billions, quadrillions of actual universes, all with different laws and constants. And we happen to be in the only one we can actually know about. But all the others actually exist. So there's no mystery at all about why this one's just right for us. It just happens to be the right one for us. And because the quadrillions of others also exist and they're not right for us, so we can't know about them. So this multiverse theory is surprisingly popular. I mean, very influential. Someone like Lord Rees, who's the Astronomer Royal and who was president of the Royal Society and master of Trinity College, Cambridge, is one of its advocates. And one reason that people advocate it is, as Lord Rees himself has said, this way we can get rid of God, because you don't need a deistic God to fine-tune it if you say there's billions of universes that are all actually there. But of course, it doesn't get rid of God, because as some theologians have pointed out, an infinite God could be the God of an infinite number of universes. So they haven't even got rid of God. They've simply proliferated universes without limit, almost. The ultimate violation of Occam's razor, the principle that you shouldn't multiply entities unnecessarily. So that's where the present debate is, the universe versus the multiverse. And it's all based on the inertia of this old idea of eternal laws. My approach, as you know, is to say, well, actually, the universe isn't governed by laws, it's governed by habits. There's a kind of memory in nature, and that habits build up through repetition. And the more often things are repeated, the more habitual they become. And so if something's been repeated innumerable times, like the behavior of hydrogen atoms, they behave as if they're following an eternal law. Things asymptotically approach a kind of limit where the habit gets so well established that it is running in such deep grooves of habit. It's as if it follows an eternal law. But if you look at new phenomena, like the formation of new chemicals and new crystals, or new patterns of behavior in animals, or new structures, self-organizing structures in plants. In the course of evolution, many new things happen. Then, to start with, one should see the habit building up. They should get easier to appear. They should happen more readily, happen more quickly. And that's what my hypothesis of morphic resonance predicts, that you should be able to see habits building up. And there's circumstantial evidence that this really happens. Of course, it's controversial. And people then say, well, how does it work? How can something influence other things across space and time? This is impossible. You can't possibly have something like that, non-locality in space and time. Well, we've got non-locality in space in quantum physics, and most people have got used to that. And I think a kind of non-locality in space and time is not a very big stretch compared with what we're already used to from quantum physics. But when people try and attack the idea of morphic resonance on the ground that it's stretching credulity, etc., what they take for granted is that mathematical laws of nature in some kind of intellectual realm beyond space and time are influencing matter in a way that no one's ever explained. So it's not as if there's one mystery compared with common sense and hard facts. The laws of nature propose enormous mysteries and problems if you think about them, what they are and how they can possibly work. And let alone all the problems they throw up, the eternal law idea, when it's confronted with an evolving universe. And if we take seriously the metaphor of law, then laws do actually evolve. There's no such thing as eternal laws in human experience. The laws of Britain today are different from the laws of Britain 100 years ago, and the laws of China today are different, and the laws of the US are different, and laws of everywhere are different from what they used to be in the past. And here in Britain, we have a system of common law where it's not just legislation by Parliament that affects our laws, it's precedents. And precedents are decided by the exercise of the law itself. And once there's a precedent, a legal precedent, then that establishes a new legal habit. So actually, if we take seriously the metaphor of law, then it suggests a system of evolving law, including an evolution of laws through precedents.
I wonder whether I mean, well, just actually one immediate reflection on that is that David Bentley Hart in his recent wonderful book, All Things Are Full of Gods, he picks up on the irony that you're wonderfully pointing to there in a different way. And in a way, he says that Aristotle's notion of formal causes never went away because his way of saying that law affects matter can be resolved through referencing Aristotle's notion of formal causation, which again is not it's not a sort of push and pull notion of cause and effect, but is the rational ordering of the way that things are. It's kind of implicit in the way that things are. So the formal cause, I don't know if you think of standing at the traffic lights and you wait for the green man before you cross the road. The material element is the physicality of the world. The efficient element, Aristotle's second kind of causative relation, is your body and so on. The car's stopping, the lights changing, that physical change. But the formal cause is the law that red and green men at the pedestrian crossing are manifesting, are enacting, and then you wait for the green light to show before you cross the road. And then the final cause is that this is good for society because it means that cars can move, people can cross the road, and it reduces the number of accidents. So, Bentley Hart has quite a lot of fun pointing out that if you follow the world as you're describing, which of course, people do, formal cause never went anywhere. It's been sort of wrapped up in this notion of laws. But sort of slightly putting that to one side, I also wonder, as you were talking then, about this older notion of telos, of final causes, of directionality, and maybe tending towards that which is good. Because if you read some physicists, at least, and I'm thinking here particularly of Paul Davies, a well-known popular physicist as well as a professor of physics, he has introduced the notion of certain principles that are like tendencies that are propelling the cosmos in certain directions, and in particular towards the emergence of life and then conscious life, and then the capacity to reflect itself on the being aware, i.e. us, as if the universe has a built-in propensity to wake up. So this is something, it's not quite like a habit because it's not blind. It does have a certain direction. But on the other hand, it's not just a sort of blank law. And I think that this can be linked back actually to the older understanding of things in a way, because for figures like Plato and Pythagoras, there was a qualitative element to the way they describe things. So numbers, for example, in Plato don't just mean quantities kind of stacking up abstractly, but represent a kind of soul, a kind of quality of presence as well. So there's not just the number one, but there's notion of unity, and there's not just the number of two, but there's the notion of two-ness. So for example, there's a nice moment that Plato describes Socrates one day watching raindrops falling out of the sky, and notices that two raindrops merged midair and became one raindrop. And the direction of that reflection is not, what happens to the volume of the raindrops or something, a more quantitative discussion that would be the more modern, natural way of going, but is a qualitative discussion, is that what happens to the two-ness of the raindrops when they become one and become a kind of unity. So this notion of how quantity and quality might be wrapped up in this great history strikes me. I mean, another way which I've noticed it is that Galileo gave some lectures on Dante's Divine Comedy, and the reason he did that was because the Divine Comedy every so often references the dimensions of, say, the Inferno, and Dante, being the medieval figure, really what he's doing when he references the dimensions of hell is not trying to describe it in some physical way as we would now mean it, but in terms of how hell gets more and more constrained. It's a qualitative narrowing of life. And so the dimensions get smaller and smaller and smaller. So it's a tightening of being, if you like, which of course is moving in the opposite direction to the divine, which is an expansion of being, which is what Dante experiences in the Paradise. But Galileo, he gave his lectures on the Divine Comedy because he wanted to show that the new quantitative sense of number didn't undermine the qualitative experience of the cosmos that the medieval mind was much more interested in. Yeah, so that really my point, apart from those sort of slight footnotes, is the sense of telos, and whether habit might be qualified because there are tendencies that you might discern, and whether that would be part of the thesis that you propose as well.
Well, I think so. If you see the whole universe as an organism, which is the main alternative metaphor to the machine. I mean, mechanistic science takes the machine as the metaphor for everything, and machines are designed by an external intelligence. Machines, of course, do have purposes. That's why we build them. That's why we buy them. That's why we make them, because a car has the purpose of getting you from one place to another. It doesn't have its own purpose, but it serves your purpose. So machines have extrinsic purpose outside themselves. If they had no purpose at all or were useless, we wouldn't build them, buy them, make them, or anything. But the point about an organism is it has its own purposes, self-organizing. At the very least, the purpose of an organism is come into being and to continue in its being. A plant grows to mature and then it tries to preserve itself until it's reproduced, or until it's reproduced repeatedly. So survival and reproduction, or self-preservation, are very basic features of organisms. But they also have their own goals. A plant develops towards a mature form where it can flower and set seed. So if the universe is like an organism rather than like a machine, then it would imply it has some kind of telos or goal. And Teilhard de Chardin, who was, an evolutionary philosopher of, I think, considerable importance, saw this telos of the whole universe as to do with consciousness, something to do with consciousness, the development of consciousness, and human consciousness is part of that. So, yes, I think we can easily see that as part of it. And I think seeing the laws as like formal causes, they're patterns that shape what's happening. But I think they're evolving formal causes, which isn't in Plato or Aristotle because they didn't have an evolutionary view. But our modern conception of nature is radically evolutionary. Our modern conception of society is radically evolutionary. It's all about technical innovation, economic growth, economic development and improvements and reforms and so forth. I mean, it's completely obsessed with all those things. So I think these evolving formal causes are part of the world organism. There's one other point that I think we need to look at, which is that there are some people, philosophers, who are very anti-Platonic and against intellectual abstractions, and they'd like to say that laws of nature aren't things out there which are sort of shaping the universe from beyond time and space. They're nothing more than regularities that we observe and describe. And so Bacon was a bit inclined, although he had on the one hand the out there theological background to the laws, his strong empirical bent meant that he thought that we should discover through empirical research what these regularities are. So there's this aspect, this empirical approach to laws says they're nothing but regularities we describe. They're not out there. They're just in our own minds. But then that leaves two problems unsolved. First of all, why are the regularities that we can describe? I mean, if we can describe regularities about the behavior of atoms, molecules, and boiling fluids and so forth, melting points of crystals, we're describing regularities, but why are there regularities in the first place? That point of view doesn't answer the question of the existence of regularity to start with. And the second thing is that if laws are simply regularities we describe, in an evolving universe, the regularities evolve. So that point of view, this empirical view of laws as mere descriptions of what's happening, would actually mean that the laws would evolve, because if the regularities evolve, the descriptions of the regularities must evolve too. And therefore, it would get away from the idea of eternal laws that can't possibly change. So that is a common view among some philosophers of science, that they're just descriptions of regularities. But as I say, then it fits an evolutionary view of law, although they don't usually take it to mean that, but then leaves unsolved the problem of the regularities in the first place.
And I guess it becomes a bit circular, because they might respond by saying, well, you need to have regularities, otherwise you'd have nothing of any complexity at all. But that's just sort of putting the cart before the horse.
Yes,
Yeah.
it presupposes regularities. And regularities means things that are regular, that obey rules, literally, or laws. It's just another way of saying that they obey some kind of rule or law or principle.
Another thought that I had, which can be a kind of obsession in the philosophy of religion, is how the notion of miracles might fit in here, because miracles can be defined as, breaches in the laws of nature, and a philosopher like David Hume would describe miracles like that and use it in order to ridicule miracle, because he would say that the whole point about laws of nature is they can't be breached, and so therefore miracles can't happen. Now, just as another footnote, the wonderful historian of ideas, Peter Harrison, in his latest book on these kind of things, points out that David Hume's deploying a bit of a bait and switch strategy here, because the whole point is that laws of nature depend upon a deistic cosmology. So God, as it were, is written through the laws of nature. So then to turn that against the possibility of God being present in the cosmos is this bait and switch approach. But I wonder whether, moving on from the notion of, rigorous, unchanging, abstract law, opens up the space for a more active divine presence. So a miracle wouldn't be a kind of breaking of a law of nature, with the sort of sense, even if you believe in God, the sense that's a rather unsatisfactory notion somehow, because, why does a miracle happen in one place but not in another? This sort of problem of the interventionist God. But if instead there's a kind of flexibility, there's a kind of experimentation even in the cosmos, and that things like habits are based as much on sympathies and resonances and memories as you're saying, then the unusual might be expected to happen every so often alongside the usual, because there is a kind of stretch and pull in the cosmos, and this mentality isn't just a strange presence holding law together, but is itself a kind of active presence that's working through custom and habit. And you, I guess, could have a sort of chain of being notion that when you got to more complex systems and so on, then that mental reality would play a greater and greater part, which of course is how we experience life. And we can make ourselves move by volition in the way that a stone can't, even if the stone is obeying some kind of basic habit. But I just wonder where, again, I guess to clarify my thought is whether what you're describing, this new sense of things, would make more space, maybe not for miracle, that's not quite the right word, but for a more active and expansive sense of divine presence.
I think so. I mean, the idea of miracles breaking the laws of nature is Hume's construct that you've got these rigid laws and they're absolutely fixed and everything's determined by them. It implied a kind of determinism. And then you've got this ridiculous idea of God suspending the laws of nature just to make a miracle happen occasionally. And I mean, it's an idea he developed in order to ridicule religion. But it's first of all the idea that the so-called laws of nature are rigidly deterministic, which was widely believed in the 19th century, is no longer believed. Nobody any longer believes in absolute determinism. In the 19th century, it was a very widespread belief. T.H. Huxley, who was, again, very anti-religious, Darwin's bulldog, said that if you knew the position and momentum of all the particles in the early universe, you should be able to predict the exact flora and fauna of the United Kingdom in 1867, that everything was totally determined. And people didn't believe in free will because they thought everything went on in the brain was totally determined. Well, with quantum theory, the causation in physics is probabilistic, and unlikely things can happen. In fact, the whole point of probability is that you often see the more common or regular pattern, but there's like a bell curve has tails at the end where very unlikely things happen occasionally. I mean, this is the very nature of probability. And since biological mutations in the DNA, which in neo-Darwinian evolutionary theory are the driving force of creativity, are random, they're quantum random events which are unlikely, improbable. Mutations are rare, but they're, in the neo-Darwinian theory, the source of creativity when filtered through natural selection. But so the improbable events happen all the time in standard materialist evolutionary theory. Mutations that only happen once in every 100 million times the DNA reproduces. They're very rare, but they have huge consequences. And in fact, any evolutionary view has to admit creativity, because evolution has to be creative if it's going to happen at all. If it's just habits or just repetition, it wouldn't be evolution. It has to include creativity. And creativity is rare and unusual. It's not happening all the time. Most of the time, habits and regular patterns are happening. Even in human societies, the number of people who are truly creative is relatively small. And so if you regard creativity as a kind of miracle, because it's improbable, unlikely, and unpredictable, then we're just take them for granted in the very fact we technologies and we want to pay people to do research in universities and research institutes. We want them to be creative. We want something improbable to happen that we couldn't have predicted. And you could say that the immanence of the divine in nature, insofar as God is an ultimate source of creativity, is evidenced through the entire evolutionary process and indeed through human creativity, which we're so proud of today. I mean, we're very proud of the fact humans are immensely creative and innovative and considered a really good thing if people in Silicon Valley are making disruptive innovations all the time. So I think that this view of causation as within an organic universe, which may have many goals, but an ultimate goal perhaps to do with consciousness, and probabilistic habits and causation leaves plenty of room for improbable events. In fact, it depends on them.
With this extra layer that it's not just random events, but that random events can lead to detectable sort of directions of travel, if you like. I mean, I'm thinking the work of Simon Conway-Morris here in Convergence, that evolution finds the same pathway to solve adaptive problems repeatedly, many times, both at the micro and the macro biological level. And so I guess the sense is that can be extended to things tending towards the good itself, not just, as it were, what's good for the survival of the organism, but maybe other kinds of goodness, other kinds of beauty, and so on, which would fit then with a more theistic worldview.
If there wasn't randomness or indeterminism, there wouldn't be the chance of higher level causes imposing patterns upon it. So I think any system which has causal influences, top-down causal influences, has to have a lot of indeterminism, because indeterminism works through ordering things that were otherwise, the creativity works through ordering things that were otherwise disordered or random. So although the neo-Darwinian theory of evolution makes all mutation random, if we look at epigenetic evolution, where organisms adapt to their environment and then their offspring can inherit their adaptations, this is a creative act, this kind of evolution. It depends on a kind of intelligent, holistic creativity, adaptation in form or behavior. And if that survives natural selection or is favored by it, then it can be inherited. It's a completely different view of evolution from purely random mutations, and gives a much greater role to top-down causal factors working through formal and final causes, on a world which is probabilistic or indeterminate and therefore open to change.
Well, look, there's echoes of older worldviews kind of coming through the modern period, the birth of science, but it's still shifting, still changing, within sciences, and your ideas are important imaginatively to keep thinking about what's really going on apart from anything else. And as you mentioned just there, the notion of formal and final cause, that was sort of put to one side, it kind of keeps pressing back. Plus the new element, like you're saying, of evolution as well. So I guess it's sort of the story of laws continues, and it's a bit of a watch this space and see how things continue to evolve, which is quite fast, I guess, now.
It's all speeding up.
Well, look, thanks very much, Rupert. That was wonderful to explore.
Thanks, Mark.